meeting is being recorded.
And with that, I would like to kick us off. Thank you all for being here tonight. I would like to introduce Chris Osgood, our Office of Climate Resilience Director, to give us some opening.
Perfect. Kate, thank you so much. And Kate, thank you so much for your leadership on this project. As Kate mentioned, I'm Chris Osgood. I have the great pleasure of leading the City of Boston's Office of Climate Resilience and serving as a senior advisor to the mayor. And on behalf of the mayor and on behalf of our Chief Climate Officer, Brian Sweat, I want to thank all of you, not just for being here tonight, but for all of the work that all of you do every single day to make our city more resilient and more livable and more a place that everybody can continue to call home for generations to come. The focus tonight is really looking at how we can move forward on a set of long-term plans to protect you and your homes and your community from the long-term risk of coastal flooding that we're facing as a city. All of this work has a foundation in Climate Ready Boston, the Climate Ready Boston work that so many of you were directly involved in, including the creation of the Coastal Resilience Solutions Plans in 2017 and in 2022 for Charlestown, the work which has gone into the now under construction Ryan Playground by Sullivan Square, the work which is being led by our planning department, by Rich McGinnis and by Ksenia Aquaviva, looking at nearer term resilience solutions along the Little Mystic Channel and for the Charlestown Navy Yard. That has provided an incredibly important foundation as we look to make sure that we are protecting all of you and our entire city from coastal flood risk. And as we do this work, which is focused on the nearer term risk, we're also looking at a set of projects that are going to be longer term that look at flood risk over the course of the century. The Army Corps is an incredibly important partner for us in this. They bring a lot of expertise and experience and capacity to be able to look at risk management projects. And they're one part of the solution that we are focused on for those longer term protections for the city of Boston. Engaging the Army Corps happens through something called a coastal storm risk management study. That is what we are engaged in right now. It is a 6-year study for the city of Boston. And over the last 3 years, the Corps has been looking at the risk that Boston faces due to increasing sea level rise and storm surge. Over the next 3 years, the Corps is looking at what are a suite of projects that can help manage that risk, that protect our communities from flooding, that are feasible to build, and that work for our communities. This is a set of projects that get submitted in 2028 in a report to Congress, and it's that report which then unlocks the opportunity for federal funding to be able to advance those projects in the 2030s and beyond. Because the Army Corps process is a long-term process, that is why the city is also focused on this nearer term work. And while it is a long-term process, that work to identify that suite of partnership opportunities with the Army Corps in some ways starts this year, and in Charlestown, in some ways starts tonight, where we have an opportunity to be able to hear from the Corps about the process, and for you to be able to ask questions about the process itself, and really to begin to look at some of the geographic areas of focus that the Army Corps has identified. As Kate mentioned at the top, there's going to be some additional opportunities for question and answer at the end of the presentation that both Kate and Jeff will be giving. Jeff Herzog, who is leading this process for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. In addition to that, and Kate will go through this, there are some opportunities for office hours over the course of this week. There'll be more opportunities for engagement over the course of the study, and certainly as this project moves into design. So again, I want to thank all of you for being here tonight, for all that you've already done to help make our city more resilient, and for your engagement in this process. And before I turn it back to Kate, I just want to see if there's any elected officials or members of their team who would like to introduce themselves or offer any opening remarks. Not seeing any, or feel free to sort of add your name to the chat. Similar opportunity for any members of the press if they'd like to introduce themselves. By all means, please feel free to put your information in the chat. And again, thank you all for being here tonight. And I will turn it back over to Kate.
Thank you, Chris. So welcome all. I'm Kate Rosa. I am a senior project manager with the Office of Climate Resilience, and we are here tonight to, as Chris just mentioned, have an introduction to the city and federal teams that are working on this coastal storm risk management study. I'm going to walk through some background about Climate Ready Boston in Charlestown in particular, And then we're going to walk through and hear from our Army Corps team, from Jeff, about the process and where we are at and what we would like to hear from you for questions and opportunities we have coming up for feedback. So let's see if I can share our poll. This is just going to be a test poll. We'll see if we can get this started. The poll did not want to get started. So in fact, we will continue. So apologies, maybe I'll be able to get it up and running by the next poll. Anyway, welcome. We're really glad you're here. Um, I just wanted to give a little background on where we've traveled to be able to get to where we are today with the Army Corps project. So just a little under 10 years ago, the city of Boston um, undertook the preliminary risk assessment for how climate change will create vulnerabilities for us in the city of Boston. And we looked at specific scenarios under heat waves and droughts or extreme temperature conditions, the many ways that both extreme precipitation and sea level rise will affect coastal flooding, and how coastal storms will impact flooding. So from this study, we were able to set the foundation for the data that would be used when implementing our resilient harbor vision. And the goal with looking at our, in 2018, released resilient harbor vision, it was putting the pieces together across our 47 miles of Boston Harbor coastline to be able to understand what could be possible that would achieve both coastal climate protections while also fulfilling some of the other items like equitable and just access to our waterfront and climate resilient solutions that can be adapted over time. So for the last 8 years or so, between 2017 and 2022, we've been developing our vision plans for neighborhood level conceptual planning efforts to be able to come up with some ideas, some concepts of what could be possible. And we worked with you, the community, to help develop these. So thank you again for continuing to help us while we work to implement this work. So for Charlestown, they were the first and the last edition of our planning by neighborhood. So we're really taking this study and building off of that vision. So the analogy that I like to use when I talk about design is if it feels like we're going in circles, to some extent we are. So I just want to ground us in that the design process is a circle. But I want to also help you to see, stepping back and from the side, that this is climbing a staircase. It is a spiral staircase. So with each new amount of information that we receive, and we will learn more about that from the core side, how they're approaching the planning, we're able to go up a stair. So currently we are going up from floor two, which is our conceptual plan, and we're working towards a preliminary design. So as we know, coastal flooding in Boston is not necessarily something that is going to wait until the 2030, 2050, and 2070 time horizons. We are seeing the effects of coastal flooding and sea level rise now. These are just some examples of storms in 2018 and 2022 that might have happened in your front yard. The way that the Office of Climate Resilience in the City of Boston is approaching the Climate Ready Boston planning implementation phase, or our next 10 years, is really into three categories. We have today's storms, we have this decade's storms, and then we have beyond this decade's storms. So we are currently strengthening our response to flooding events with our partners in the Office of Emergency Management as well as looking to update any of our existing or introduce new temporary deployables for these events. We're also looking at this decade's storms in particular, and we're starting with city-led projects now for implementation. And for Charlestown, one of those examples is our City of Boston Planning Department study that is ongoing and is focusing on the area in yellow, the Little Mystic Channel, and the Charlestown Navy Yard areas. And the focus of this study is to help develop solutions or preliminary design plans for what we can look at to cover this decade's storms. For beyond 2030, for our mid and long-term flood time design horizons, we are working with our partnership with the U.S. Army Corps, that's why we're here today, to look at ways that we can help invest and adapt today's projects to be able to fit tomorrow's storms, as well as look at how our federal partnership can unlock help in implementing these long-term flood path projects. So why now and why Army Corps? The U.S. Army Corps has a specific charge that they lead with as part of their role in the U.S. Army and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. They have a specific task to help protect the federal interest. And for us here in the city of Boston, we share that federal interest. The shared interest, as you'll learn, as Jeff will talk about, is centered around protecting people and looking at ways to protect how people stay safe through critical infrastructure, housing, evacuation routes, and of course, protecting natural resources. So this process is detailed and specific to the Army Corps. They follow a multi-year process. We are about halfway through that process now. And it's specific for a reason because it will ultimately lead to congressional approval down the road. So up to 65% of a federal match for projects that we implement through this program will be matched using federal dollars. And this is something that we as a city will need to absolutely partner with and consider as a partner for helping us to implement our long-term, midterm, and long-term storm flood pathway closures. So as I mentioned, where are we in the process? We started this work in 2022. We're currently in our first of its kind preliminary draft. Everything you're going to see tonight is still a draft and open for feedback of where we would like to build and looking at the toolkit of what options the U.S. Army Corps through its partnership can help us provide. We do have a little bit of road ahead of us. The report to Congress will not be until 2028. I am going to have to skip these slides. They are not working today, and I'm so sorry. So with that, as I try to work on the Slido in the background, I have the pleasure of introducing our federal partner, Jeff Herzog, who will be able to kind of walk us through what our work has been to date and what we have so far today to help present to you all. Take it away, Jeff.
Hey, thank you, Kate, and good evening, everybody. On behalf of Colonel Justin Pavis, the commander of the New England District, and we're right there in Concord Park, Massachusetts. Thank you for taking time out of your busy evening. We understand that there are many other things that you have going on as we kick off the spring season, but instead you chose to spend this evening with us. And so we want to be very respectful of your time, and we want to be able to maximize the question and answer. So I have been identified by my wife of having two problems. Number one is I speak way too quickly. And so I am going to intentionally try to work on that tonight and enunciate to help out the interpreters. So thank you, and having grace for me as well as patience with them as they try to keep up. But the other thing is after 27 years of federal service between the U.S. Army active duty service as well as my time here in the Corps of Engineers, I often let acronyms slip. And oftentimes the acronyms mean 3 or 4 different things. So I will do the best that I can to avoid using acronyms tonight. But if I do, I've got plenty of people on my team and with the city who can help to interpret some of these acronyms. So with that being said, let's kind of talk about the CSRM process. That's the first acronym, right? I started violating my rule from the first point. That is Coastal Storm Risk Management. And Coastal Storm Risk Management identifies from Congress an authority that allows us to look at those events associated with tropical events such as hurricanes. But what we see here in the New England region specifically are nor'easters. And so with nor'easters, you all have experienced it with Grayson and Riley, and you experience it 3 to 4 times a year with these nor'easters, and that is storm surge and wave attack. But to compound that and exacerbate that problem, we have sea level change. And so we have to look at the infrastructure resilience over a period of analysis. And so that's kind of where we're going to take this discussion. But before we get any further, let's go to the next slide and talk about some of these hazards a little bit more. We'll kind of describe, are we able to go to the next slide? All right. It's important when you look at coastal storm risk to understand what are the hazards facing your community, because that's what's going to drive your solution set. So what we've identified here are a few different hazards. Sea level change, check. We experience that in the New England region. Storm surge, again, anybody who experiences the astronomical high tides along Long Wharf, and you're seeing that sea level change. But then with Grayson and Riley, when you have sea level change on top of these wind-driven storm surge events, you start to see that inundation. And so that's inundation hazard associated with the storm surge. But then there's also wave attack and erosion. Now, wave attack and erosion, I think most people would agree who have experience in the region would say that the 2 largest risks and hazards that face the Charlestown neighborhood, as well as most of the Boston Harbor neighborhoods, is that sea level change and storm surge. And so with that in mind, we want to look at how can we focus on closing those long-term flood pathways. Again, in our partnership with the city of Boston, you all, regardless of what your opinion is of the city government, I will tell you that in my experience working across the nation, you have a very proactive, forward-thinking city government that is looking at that near-term and medium-term risk ahead of what we're looking at for this long-term risk. Because we, with the Corps of Engineers, are a piece of the community resilience puzzle. And in this case, we are a piece of the resilience puzzle in the community along the Boston Harbor neighborhoods that focus on coastal storm risk over a longer period of time. So you're going to hear us often talk about a 100-year planning horizon, and we're going to talk about a 50-year period of economic analysis. That's key to understand. That's why the city of Boston and Boston Water Sewer Commission and the state of Massachusetts, with all their near-term risks, they have to keep moving forward. But in the meantime, because we have this relationship and this partnership, we're able to ensure that everything that they're bringing in and executing now, we can fold into a much larger and long-term comprehensive system. And that way it's not creating a bunch of redundancy or rework and tearing up millions of dollars worth of efforts today to address a long-term problem. So because we've started this partnership early on in the process, we're able to work together to develop a comprehensive long-term solution that includes these near-term recommendations, but also incorporates our longer-term solutions. So with that being said, we are looking at closing those long-term flood pathways. Well, how and why would you want to do that? So if we go to the next slide, we're going to see a couple of different colors. But the common picture here is much of the city of Boston was built out. Much of the city of Boston has waterways throughout. Much of the city of Boston has stormwater outlets and such. And so with all of that in mind, you have a significant inundation threat in the future associated with both coastal storm risk, but also with sea level change. Now, at the city level and the state level, they've adopted a consultants model, and it's been adopted throughout New England. So it's not just the state of Massachusetts and the city of Boston, but it's called the Massachusetts Coastal Flood Risk Model. The Corps of Engineers, because we have to look at it from a more strategic and economic perspective, we have to look at life cycle, and we have to look at economic, and we have to look at just more than frequency based. And so we have to use our own storm model, which is called the Coastal Hazard System. Without getting into great detail about that, the bottom line is when you look at the two pictures overlaid, it's going to show that the planning decisions made with Plan Charlestown by the city and by the state and with Boston Water Sewer Commission, those will line up and be able to tie into a much longer term solution, even though we are using a different model. So that's the important thing about this. The other important thing to take away from this, you see MCFRM, 1% at 2070. Well, you see CHS, 1% at 2090. Don't get caught up in 2070, 2090, 2050. Get your arms and get our arms wrapped around the fact that it's not a matter of if sea level change occurs. It's occurring. There's documented evidence of it. It's a matter of when will it reach certain water surface elevations. And at each level of government and in planning, you're going to determine and make decisions based off of certain water surface elevations. And so for us, our sea level change scenarios may vary a little bit differently than the MCFRM. But at the same time, we're looking at much longer term scenarios, whereas MCFRM in the city of Boston and even the New England region, you're looking at those very near term threats. So it makes sense that those curves may be a little bit more aggressive for planning purposes. So bottom line is we're working together, we're collaborating together, and we're really telling the same story with our science and engineering. And that's an important thing for us to consider as you see all the different efforts that are occurring throughout your neighborhoods. So let's go to the next slide. As Kate alluded to, protection of people, right? That is our mission, protection of people. But with that protection of people, there's several categories around that. You've got critical infrastructure and transportation. You have public transportation. Many people, maybe in Charlestown, you're commuting via the Orange Line on the bus, or maybe you're utilizing a car. But when you're living in East Boston, many of those communities and those residences really depend, over 50% of the population uses public transportation for their means. And so that protection of that critical infrastructure and transportation is important. But we can't forget about our natural resources. When you consider your community, you have to consider not only your developed community, but also your biophysical community, because when you start to change and make changes to your landscape without considering those natural resources, that's when you end up with water quality issues. That's when you end up with invasive species. That's when you end up with a lot of different issues that you didn't necessarily think about. So those are some of the things that we do consider, even though we're looking at protecting people. Part of protecting people is considering those natural resource impacts. And of course, in the top left, not to underscore the importance of it, but protection of housing. Now, I come to that one last because not everybody in the city of Boston lives in a single-story slab-on-grade home. There are so many between row homes with multiple dwellings, between apartment buildings, condo structures, single-family homes. Protection of housing may look different in different parts of the neighborhood. Next slide, thank you. And again, I apologize if I am talking too quickly. Someone just kind of throw it in the chat, slow down, and I'll do the best I can. So when we talk about coastal storm risk, the key word to pull out of that is risk. Now, I often like to explain risk as an equation, but it's hard to visualize an equation, especially for me. I like to be able to explain it. So when we talk about risk equals the likelihood or the probability of a hazard occurring multiplied by what is the consequence of that event occurring. And so when you look at a hazard such as inundation, what is the probability of that occurring? Well, if you have a clear line of sight between the water and the land, and there is low elevation between the two, you have a pretty high probability of it happening. But if it's just open floodplain, maybe it's wetland. Maybe you want that inundation. And so it's very low consequence. It's that one. So maybe it's 2 times 1 equals 2, right? Or maybe it is big impact, but it's very low probability. When we look at Grayson and Riley, those were not low probability events. But a tropical event, a Category 3 hurricane coming through, that's a pretty low probability event. However, the impact, as we experienced to the south during Hurricane Sandy in Connecticut and New York, can be very high. So then you also have those high probability and big impact events. That's when we start talking about those Grayson and Riley type events. And in the future, as you look at sea level change and changing water surface elevations, it's going to increase even more. So what do you do about that? Well, in order to manage that risk, you either have to reduce the probability from it occurring, or you have to reduce the consequence, or maybe you reduce both. When we talk, let's go to the next slide, please. When we talk about reducing the probability or reducing the consequence, what are we kind of talking about here? Well, the way I like to describe it, because it works for me, and if it doesn't work for you, I apologize, and we're happy to have some office hours and discuss further. But if I'm reducing the probability of something from occurring, I'm building something. I'm putting something in the way that storm surge, it hits it instead of inundating the community. But if I am allowing the surge to occur, but I am putting in stop logs or I am elevating structures so that the water goes around it, well, the probability, it's still happening, but I'm reducing the consequence. So what I like to explain to people is if you are structurally stopping the water from coming in, well, then you are doing a structural type measure. But if you are either adapting, accommodating, then maybe you are doing that reduced consequence, and so it's considered non-structural. And then, of course, you have non-structural, and that is through zoning. That is through understanding that over time, you're going to have to change the way you zone areas, and you're going to have to change the way you develop areas, either to decrease the risk or decrease the probability. So those are kind of the 3 drawers that we work with in the Corps of Engineers. Next slide, please. One more visualization, because when we look at it from Charlestown perspective, we have that big wide opening at the top. All right, we know that storm surge, and we know that inundation is the key driver of risk, the highest level of risk. And so we can do structural to reduce the probability. We can do non-structural to reduce the consequence, and we can do non-structural, non-physical in order to kind of manage how we adapt and evolve as a community. But then you have to bring it down a little bit further. Well, what is actually possible to construct based off of the geology in the area, based off of the density of population in the area? And then you take it down one more level, so you get those draft options, is what is the best fit for the Charlestown neighborhood? What makes sense? Because the reality is this, and this is something that we recognize, and it's something that your leaders within the community recognize. 360 days out of the year, you're not going to need this system to function and work properly. But that 360 days out of the year, this system needs to become a part of the fabric and the character and the identity of that community. And so what we want to do is make sure that we incorporate from a full landscape ecology type mindset, what is structurally and engineeringly feasible, what is possible, what makes sense to reduce probability or consequence, but then how does it impact the community on a daily basis? And with all of that, that's how we are going to generate our draft type options. And I think we were gonna take a break. I don't know, Kate, what do you think?
We're going to keep on rolling. We're going to have extra time for questions tonight, is how I look at that. We're going to skip our...
let's do this. I'm going to throw you a curveball, because since Slido's not working, let's take 1 or 2 minutes and make sure that everybody understands the concept of risk as we see it, and how we get to our draft options through our process, because I think that's going to really help people in this next piece. So I don't know if somebody has a question in the chat, or if there is somebody needs to come off of mute, but if there's somebody who doesn't quite understand the idea of risk as we see it, or if they don't understand our process, maybe now we can take 30 seconds and just have that conversation. So I see from Bud, does the USACE work not include protection of business and commercial interests as opposed to housing? Yes, yeah, and so that was that kind of second level, Bud, where we talked about kind of like stop logs, or maybe it's dry flood proofing or wet flood proofing building adaptations, such as what you see in Spalding Rehabilitation Hospital. Beautiful example, absolutely beautiful example of business and building adaptation. What they're doing in South Boston along the World Trade Center, that's another example. Economics on a national level, a regional level, and a local level are absolutely a consideration of how we go through our analysis. It's one of 3 categories. So we look at the socioeconomic and the public impacts and benefits of our projects. We also look at the economic, and that is, you know, kind of what you're talking about, the business and commercial interests, not only the local and actual businesses, but also the maritime and transit infrastructure, commercial industry as well. And then there's the natural and that environmental piece. So I hope that answers that question. Any other questions about risk before we move forward? And I don't see any hands. I don't know, Kate, Lindsay, if we see any hands. All right. Hearing and seeing nothing, I will go ahead and move forward then. Thank you again, Bud, for the question. I hope everyone is comfortable putting questions into the chat, and then they'll come to our group, and that way we can identify. Are we good, Kate? I saw a message come up.
Yep, you're all good.
Okay, all right. So if this looks familiar, I'm glad, because that means that you've been participating since 2016 with the Climate Ready Boston. And really, the Climate Ready Boston tools are very similar to that toolkit that we will use to either reduce probability or reduce consequence. But it's important to understand within these tools, why are you utilizing a particular tool in a particular area? So I think raised harbor walk is definitely one area that we can look at, and that is, you have a beautiful alternate transportation mode throughout the city and the coastline. In some areas, it's fully connected all the way around. In other areas, it's an area for improvement. But that raised harbor walk, because what does that do? That reduces the probability, but it's a structural type atmosphere. So maybe there is a buried flood wall within. So maybe it's a combination of the raised harbor walk with that, what you see in the lower left, vertical flood wall, in order to create that line of protection to reduce the probability. Sometimes you need, just based off of space constraints, because if you have an area that requires a crest at the top, such as a raised berm and dune, well, you need more space to do that. So if we're looking in an area that's constructed all the way up to the water's edge, if you're looking at an area that is very close to a road or has a very dense utility field around it, maybe you're not in a situation where you can do a wide crest with sloping faces, and maybe you just need a vertical flood wall. And maybe that vertical flood wall, from an aesthetic perspective, actually makes sense in that area. And when we talk about vertical flood walls, your mind can immediately go to Kansas or New Orleans, where you see these 15 to 25 foot flood walls. And what I can tell you is a flood wall could be 2 inches stem height, or it could be 10 feet stub height, or it could be 5 feet. It all depends on the topographic nature of the area, because it's all based off of elevation and not necessarily what we call stem height. So we'll talk about that here again in a few minutes. But then there's the other piece in that lower right corner, is that adapted buildings and those adapted structures. And that gets back to Bud's point. And again, I would encourage anybody, if you haven't seen what they've done at Spalding Rehabilitation Hospital, it's where you allow that first floor to become inundated. Maybe it's a parking garage, maybe it's an open area that everything can be moved into a dry area very easily. But then what you do is you take all your mechanical, electrical, and fire suppression and you elevate it above that base flood elevation. And that way your building becomes adaptable for future storm. And again, they did a beautiful job of the way they did that. So let's take a couple of examples. These are not examples that we're recommending for Boston, but it's to try and give you a visualization. And so if you're familiar with New Bedford, Massachusetts, about 45 minutes from Providence, or about 55 minutes from Boston, if you go down south towards the Cape. But this is an example of the New Bedford storm surge barrier. It's been operating for well over 50 years. It comes with the Corps of Engineers inspections and everything, but it's very robust, as you can see, because their focus is on those hurricane, those low probability but very high consequence events. Or you have the Norfolk raised harbor walk, raised park space type examples, right? And so that's what you'll see in that lower right. So if we go to this next one, this is where it was important for me to qualify that, you know, if you go down to New Orleans, or if you go into the Midwest along some of these areas, you'll see very tall flood walls, right? And they've turned them into walking museums and walking art galleries and such, and because they've become a fabric of their community and their identity. So I want you to take a look at this and understand that we are not recommending 12-foot flood walls or 8-foot flood walls for the community here. Ours are likely going to be much lower. In some areas, it's going to look more like an ADA handrail. In some areas, it may be, you know, based off of 4 or 5 feet, and it may require some filling behind it in order to reduce the appearance of the stem height. All of that is in the future, right? But this is just an example of how you can reduce the probability of an event from occurring. Now, if you just want to reduce the consequence, that's what that right picture looks like. That's where you take a structure, whether it's slab on grade or whether it's a basement, and we have done slab on grade elevations, you know, believe it or not, and you elevate it up. And so now it's above that base flood elevation. You're not going to stop the water from coming in, but what you are going to do is you are going to reduce the consequence to those residents inside, as well as the structure contents of that. And so that's kind of an example on a residential level of what a building adaptation looks like. All right, next slide. Well, so let's go back one slide, because I don't want to give away the end of the book. There was a question, why are they repairing the boardwalk if we need coastal storm planning? If already approved, why not use porous asphalt cement under the boardwalk? Also, why not use the old dry docks for water storage during storms? I'll just point out that in some of those areas where it appears as though they are repairing these boardwalks, Langone Park is a beautiful example. A lot of people don't realize that Langone Park is a comprehensive system for flood control. So you have those beautiful elevated ball fields, which probably makes relatively easy sense that okay, yeah, that makes sense. It stops the water. But then you have a beautiful set of tiered stairs, and they look like a great seating spot to sit there and just overlook the harbor, and you can see the Constitution. Great. But really, in fact, that is a flood control system constructed by the city of Boston. And then wherever you see those access points to get to the sidewalk, to get to the main road and everything, you see those posts in the middle, and those posts allow the city to come in when they know an event's occurring, and they're able to drop in those stop logs And so it becomes a closed system. And so in some of those areas where you see them repairing boardwalks and such, maybe in some of the areas it's just Band-Aid fixes, I'll agree. But in some of those areas, it's a deliberate flood control resilience effort that becomes transparent within 2 to 3 weeks after construction. It's just another beautiful part of the community. And that's really where we want to see this project move forward, because it's not just about, you know, stopping the flood and getting those economic benefits. It's also that economic, socioeconomic impacts and benefits to the community moving forward. All right, next slide. So how can you help us today? If you participated in any of the previous engagements that we've had, and we've had a couple, the most recent one was February 2024, and you're thinking to yourself, that was a year ago. Well, that's because we've been trying to paint our future without project condition. We've been trying to identify what is going to happen if we do nothing and sea level change occurs and the storm surge continues to exacerbate because of the sea level change. What would that look like? Well, of course, the city is already moving forward with some near-term and interim, so we have to build that in. And then we have to identify what's happening in the community. So that's the first place we need your help. What do you see in the community as far as private development, as far as public development, as far as residential developers, you know, constructing? Because we don't have visibility on everything that's going on in the city. We need your assistance. So as you start to see our projects and our alignments here in a few minutes, we need you to point out, well, you know, you're recommending that, but that's not even a problem anymore, because this company over here already developed an entire seawall, and maybe they did or maybe they didn't go through the proper permitting process, right? That's not for me to describe. But if you know of something, you know, it's important for you to share with us. If you see an area that's at risk and you've seen it flood, let us know. Maybe we didn't capture it. Right now, we're basing everything off of Climate Ready Boston, site visits, field work, as well as extensive science and engineering models. But you know what? I take great stake and give a lot of credit to what's called traditional ecological knowledge. What that means is you all out there who live it on a daily basis. You understand a lot better sometimes than maybe an engineering model, and we recognize that, and that's why we want your feedback. As well as, how can we make, I noticed tonight that we have 42 people. I'm pretty sure that there's more than 42 people in the community of Charlestown, and I'm probably pretty sure that about 12 to 15 of that 42 is our team. And so how can we better reach out and communicate with you all? Is it through QR codes along the harbor walk? Is it through billboards and signage on the bus? How can we better communicate with you? And if you want to know, here's a couple of ways. Kate, I'll let you describe how can you provide feedback. How's that?
That works. So as Jeff said, we know this is a very specific to Army Corps process. It's very prescriptive, but my job, my role at the city is to help us as a city navigate this process as the non-federal sponsor working with our federal sponsor. So this week I have office hours set up in Charlestown, and I consider this your personal invitation to please join me. I will be there Thursday evening from 6 to 8 p.m., and I welcome your questions and feedback. We will be on Zoom with our core team because they are meeting from other areas. So they will be available at those times too. Then we meet again on Thursday, May 29th. If you have a smartphone handy, I ask you to take a photo, to have the study feedback form. I will also post them in the chat when we get to our question and answer session, to be able to submit a form if a written comment format is easier for you. We also have the opportunity, if the office hour time availability doesn't work for you, you may book an appointment through this appointment booking link to meet with the Corps and the city team. We really want to make sure that we are reaching folks, and we want to be able to adapt this process to meet your needs. what we're going to do as part of this next step of information is we're going to have question and answers before we get into the last little bit of technical information. We will have time to answer questions today. If we cannot answer them today, we will record them and be able to provide them in writing on our website. You will be able to see these presentation slides posted to our Army Corps partnership website, which is at thecityofboston.gov. If you search Army Corps partnership or USACE partnership. And then we will be coming back with another round of public engagement later this year as we go from neighborhood to neighborhood to add new information, make those changes, and then report out back to you. So this is a process that will be ongoing throughout this year. So there isn't a set deadline for these feedback, but sooner is always better than later. So with that, I will toss it back to Jeff to kind of give us the last little bit of our presentation here, and then we will head directly into question and answers. So again, have that notepad ready. Back to you, Jeff.
Yeah, awesome. All right, if we go to the next slide, again, it wouldn't be a Jeff product, a Jeff presentation if I didn't put acronyms in there. The only reason I didn't say NCTWN for North Charlestown is I didn't want anyone to think it was North Carolina. But what we've done is we've taken the community of Charlestown, we've kind of broken it up into 3 large model areas, and that's what you see here: Northern Charlestown area, the Little Mystic Channel community area, as well as the Charlestown Navy Yard that extends all the way down as you get closer to the New Charles River Dam. And then you see some black lines here. These black lines kind of give you an idea, long-term flood pathways. We talked about that earlier on the risk and the hazard slide, right? And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to kind of break down by neighborhood or community within the Charlestown community. What are we looking at for alignments? We're being very intentional here to show you where the flood pathway is and where we would need to have the alignment in order to reduce the probability of something happening. And so if you see an alignment or a line and you see a structure outside of it, I would encourage you to consider either A, it ties into a different alignment in a different part of the neighborhood, or that we're looking at maybe a non-structural type building adaptation, or we're looking at a different type of approach to reduce that or manage that risk. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into the first North Charlestown area. And this, again, is really important because I think Bud has gotten a copy of this presentation before we did, because he's leading in perfect segues into a lot of these. He wants to know, well, what's the difference between this and all those projects that we were introduced to at the beginning of this presentation, right? Here's a prime example. Ryan Playground right there by the Alfred Street Bridge and Rutherford Ave. All right, the city is currently elevating that to elevation 14 feet NAVD 88. You've got many different forms of elevation. You got mean sea level, NAVD 88. You've got above ground level. You can call it what you will. But for the purposes of a city in Boston, the New England region and state, as well as the Corps of Engineers on this project, we're using NAVD 88 as kind of our description when we talk about elevations, okay? And so you'll see that they're already elevating that because they've identified that near-term flood pathway in that critical risk area. Now, over time, you're going to see longer-term flood pathways, and so that's why you see an orange line running along Rutherford Avenue in the backside of the Ryan Playground, and that's because over time in the future, it's going to flank that area, and it's going to still exacerbate that risk to the community. Likewise, 425 Medford right there at the Schraff City Center, many of you probably know it better as that, right? But that is an area where we know we need to do something. But the question is, well, what are we going to do? Part of it depends on what's going on with the community in the city there. So if that's going to become the Schraff City Center and it's going to become kind of an economic hub, et cetera, and you see fishing piers, I've been out there and I see the people fishing off the end of the pier on their lunch breaks. Never seen anyone catch anything, so we'll just call it fishing. But we don't want to cut that access off. So do we put an elevated harbor walk there? Well, maybe an elevated harbor walk cuts into too much real estate or is going to be too expensive. So maybe we want to put a backside or a front side flood wall, vertical flood wall there. All that's to be determined. But what we see is if we want to reduce the probability of that risk from occurring, then we have to follow that alignment around. Now, where we need your help is looking at that and you telling us, well, you know, if you build that alignment there, you're cutting off this driveway. If you cut off this driveway, there's no access to that parking lot. If there's no access to the parking lot, it renders that business unusable. If you render that business unusable, you're having an adverse economic impact that you weren't even tracking. And so those are the kind of feedback that we want to see here. And so this is kind of that North Charlestown area. If we take it down to the next area, so this is more of a economic area and a commercial area. I think we can mostly agree on that. But let's go down one more slide. Now we're looking at the Little Mystic Channel. You have the Massport Autoport with the roll-on, roll-off, and all the vehicles. And it's easy to say, well, just move the vehicles. You're right. That's a non-structural, non-physical type approach. Just move the vehicles and you've reduced the risk, right? However, there's still infrastructure there. Maybe there's cranes, maybe there's vents, maybe there's generators, maybe there's those types of things that require some sort of adaptation. So all that to be said is we are working with Massport specifically for Autoport as well as the airport as well as the port down by Reserves Channel, right? But where I want to focus this conversation on is I want to focus, if you're looking downstream, you're looking at that right side. You're looking at that housing community there that is kind of a combination of affordable housing, but also a combination of mixed ages and abilities, as well as some linguistic isolation in that community. And so those are people, those are our neighbors. How are we going to reduce that long-term risk? Well, in order to do that, we need to put some sort of alignment right there along that particular Little Mystic Channel. Now, if we were to put an elevated harbor walk, or if we were to create some sort of berm or something along those lines, we would either have to build out into Little Mystic Channel, which is navigable waters as a boat ramp, we would have to get the permitting, or we would have to build this direction, landward. And if you build landward and you're familiar with that area, that means that we are probably infringing upon that community in those houses there. So maybe it's not appropriate to try and do something with a crest on top and a long and a wide base. Maybe it's more appropriate to do some sort of vertical flood wall at 2 or 3 feet stub height, and you can backfill behind it in order to create kind of a walkway and a walking path using the foundation of the wall, etc. But that provides that risk reduction, that reduced probability. The problem is they're also getting flanked, and we're going to talk about it in, I think, the next slide. They're also getting flanked from a different direction, and that is from the Navy Yard side. Okay, so if we zoom in and we look at this, you see the flood pathway coming in this direction. So if we go to the next slide, we also see from the Charlestown Navy Yard side, there is a flood pathway in the future. You probably don't see it today, but in the future, flooding comes through the harbor, down 5th Street, I think that might be Vine, under the bridge, and into the community. And so if we put a wall on the Little Mystic side, but ignore this side, well then we are still allowing the risk to inundate this community. Maybe for phasing purposes, we can do this after that, but we cannot let this just simply go. Now, you're probably asking yourself, well, why would you put the wall there, and why wouldn't you put the wall further out? If we go to the next slide, we can have that conversation. If we do a coastal edge solution out here, there is a possibility that during construction, certainly you're going to have to lose some of these slips out here. And then maybe potentially in a long-term scenario, you're going to have reduced access and capability for all of these. Now, what I want you to see is we recognize that there are condos out here. We recognize that even if we only do the Vine Street flood wall, there are structures out here. So that's where we have to look at in that grid up in the upper right. Do we do a full coastal edge solution? What is the cost? What is the environmental impacts of that? If we do just a partial coastal edge solution, and then we take some of those condos are already flood-proofed and building adapted. What if we adapt the rest of those structures? Is it even possible to adapt the rest of those structures? Or do we need to take some sort of coastal edge solution around that pier too? To be determined. We are not making final decisions here. We're trying to get your input and your feedback on this. And so we're looking at some coastal edge solutions here, or we're looking at that Vine Street flood wall, and we're looking at some building adaptations out here. And that way, when the event happens, you can evacuate this smaller area rather than having to evacuate this entire community in whole. So that's what you're kind of seeing in that combination of alternatives. Next slide. All right. So at this point, I want to reiterate a couple of things. The city, the state, and the region, because you've got Belle Isle Marsh, you've got Mystic River Watershed Association, you've got lots of people doing near-term immediate need things. We're collaborating with them and we're working with them, but our focus is on that much longer term. The reality is this: we will finish our study in 2028. We will be appropriated and authorized by Congress probably in 2028, 2029, in order to start the design of the system. It'll have to be a phased implementation of the approved system because it takes time to construct this massive of the system. And so we're probably looking at sometime between 2035 and 2040 before our system is constructed. In the meantime, the risk is real, the hazards to the community is real. The city of Boston and the state recognize that, and they are moving out on those 2030 to 2050 type risks right now, and we're incorporating all of that in there. So current focus right now for us is we know what the city's doing, we know what the state's doing, we know what Boston Water Sewer Commission is doing. We know because we're working with Belle Isle Marsh, Friends of Belle Isle Marsh, and Mystic River Watershed Association. We know what's happening there. We don't necessarily know what's happening in your neighborhood, and we want to know that. And so that's what we want to focus on, getting that feedback from you. And then we will then use that feedback in our designs. I need you to understand, though, and I'm sure many of you do, if you put 20 people in a room, you're going to get 15 different answers. The reason being is because everybody has either cognitive dissonance, where we don't want it in our backyard, so focus on this, or they have their own personal experiences, or they see it on a daily basis, or maybe it's because it's their employment and it's their job to understand it. And so from our perspective, we have to take all of your feedback and we have to utilize it to develop a comprehensive and strategic system. And so we will use your feedback in our designs. And when we don't use, your recommendations, we will do our best to try and explain to you why maybe we did or didn't use that particular feedback. And you will have so many more opportunities. We're going to come back to you this fall, specifically in Charlestown. Now, if you've got more questions, come to the other meetings. Dorchester's next, and then we're going to go to East Boston, and then we're going to go to South Boston, and then we're going to go to downtown and North End. Feel free to come to all of them or come to one of them, or feel free to wait until the fall when we come out for more public scoping and kind of explaining what we've recommended. Or you can wait until February of 2026 when we go public with our draft release. This is not your only time to comment and provide feedback. All right, we appreciate that you've taken your time tonight, and we hope that you continue through this process with us. And sometimes it feels like a circle, but hopefully you can recognize that we are truly moving up that spiral staircase. With that, Kate, I think I pass it back to you, yeah?
Yep, you sure do. Thank you, everybody. So I am seeing some great questions coming in the chat. And I know, Bud, you have your hand raised and you do have the first question. So, Bud, would you prefer I read out loud, or would you like to come off mute and ask your question that you put in the chat about What is the relationship between the Charlestown project that this meeting began with and the U.S. Army Corps project? And I think you're referring to the Charlestown Navy Yard Little Mystic Channel Resilience Project. Correct me if I'm wrong, but Bud, you can go ahead and come off mute there.
Oh, thanks, Kate. Hi, Jeff. I'm just trying to clarify my earlier question. I see what you're doing now. You're going to go by neighborhood. But what I'm trying to figure out is in the Climate Ready Boston first neighborhood plans, plus a lot of detailed, more design-oriented planning work that's been done, we've already seen lots of alternative alignments, both short and long-term. And I'm trying to figure out how you all are going to take that work and blend it into what you're doing rather than sort of starting all over again, if you follow me.
And Jeff, I'm gonna ask Chris Osgood to help answer this question too, please.
Yeah, sure. Let me start. And let me start by saying Climate Ready Boston was the impetus for this U.S. Army Corps of Engineers study because of all the work that had already been done. It made it a clear need and justified investment by the federal government to come in and invest in taking this to the next step. Climate Ready Boston is the foundation for our study. And so those alignments and those recommendations that came in from Climate Ready Boston are our jumping off point. It's our starting point. Now we have to look at what are those NEPA or natural resource impacts, positive and negative. We have to look at the geologic foundations. What would it actually take to be able to construct something like that with the foundation necessary? How deep do we need to go to get to bedrock? So we take those alternatives and we really take them to that next level of what does it look like when we actually implement or construct something like this? So it's a great question, and I want everybody to hear what we're saying here is that Climate Ready Boston is not just study fatigue and wasted effort. That is the impetus and the foundation for the work that we have moving forward.
But if it is helpful, I'm also just to touch on your question in the chat, and I know that Rich McGinnis is here as well, as is Ksenia, and Rich or Ksenia, please feel free to sort of add or correct here. But I think your question, and Bud, correct me if I'm wrong, about sort of study connection was specific to the Charlestown Navy Yard Little Mystic work that the planning team kicked off 2 weeks ago. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so the principal sort of difference is really around timeline, that that is an effort that's really focused on that near or midterm flood risk, whereas the Army Corps work is focused on the long-term risk. There is significant amount of coordination between the two efforts. So the Corps was in the meetings 2 weeks ago, just the same way in which the Planning Department's project team is also in this meeting. And the intent or the hope would be that alignments that we identify are the same. And so any work by the Corps is literally sort of built on top of or uses as a foundation the great work which is going to be advanced by Rich, Ksenia, and the Arcadis team. But Rich, Ksenia, anything you would add or correct there?
Well, just that the city's planning department owns hundreds of acres of coastal real estate, and we're following the lead of the Coastal Resilient Report on making sure that our properties are resilient, that our tenants are protected, and to develop a higher level of design so that as we're making our own capital improvements, we can start integrating resilience infrastructure and design, and also a grant readiness status. Our plans point to the need for a partnership with the local, state, and federal agencies for funding sources. The core project is one of those options we have, but we will continue to proceed to move to a higher level of design just for our own capital planning needs, but also, as Chris mentioned, we're developing independent retrofit guidelines for the structures within the Navy Yard because we're not sure when we'll actually complete these longer term district scale resilient investments. So it's really putting the community on a higher level of notice and working with the property owners for independent retrofit, but also good public realm and design for the Navy Yard.
Thank you. So I'm going to go to one more question in the chat, and then I'll go back to you, Joe. I do see your hand is raised. So Kathy Abbott in the chat asked, apologies if I missed this, but what types of nature-based approaches do you use, and do you consider in-water solutions? And this is going to go to Jeff for the Army Corps toolkit and approaches to nature-based solutions.
Yeah, it's a really good question, Kathy, and I appreciate you asking. And it kind of goes back to what works for Charlestown versus what might work for Dorchester or East Boston back in the Belle Isle, Wood Island, Marsh type areas. So what is the hazard? We've identified the hazard for these particular areas is that storm surge and that inundation. And so we have to focus our efforts on that. So particularly in Charlestown, if we were to look at an in-water solution, maybe a living levee or some sort of wetland expansion type effort to reduce erosion, it's the water is still going to keep coming. And it's not necessarily wave attack. So if you're in the South Pacific or if you're in Florida, where you have areas of coral reef, where you have that reef that kind of breaks that wave action. Now, it doesn't stop the surge, but it breaks the wave action and the wave attack. And so for our particular area here in Charlestown, we are predominantly looking at those landside, shoreside features. Now, in other areas such as Belle Isle Marsh, Wood Island Marsh, or even over in Neponset, the Neponset River and Dorchester, where maybe you have some more real estate and you have more opportunity to potentially create some green space, tiered green space, that allows you to absorb the water and absorb the inundation and detain it while still creating that reduced risk and reduced probability. And so it's really going to be a kind of neighborhood by neighborhood solution. But what I can tell you is based off of the amount of development and the density of development in the Charlestown area, we are predominantly looking at shoreside solutions, and in our gray-green hybrid type solutions, we will do the best that we can to kind of create that hybrid type. But as far as straight in-water green type solutions or creating massive open green space for flood detention and storage, there's just not a lot of opportunity in that Charlestown neighborhood.
Okay, Joe, I'm going to ask you to unmute, please, to ask your question.
Thanks, Kate. Great meeting, great presentations, everyone. My question was similar to Kathy's, but I wanted to kind of follow up on what she had asked. And Jeff, I appreciate you mentioning, the opportunities for hybrid, gray and green approaches. I think that's really important to, communicate to residents and to be considering here as well. And so, my question kind of had two parts. The first was, is the Army Corps' Engineering with Nature program involved in this project at all? Are you coordinating with them, or do they have a representative on your team, Jeff? And then the second is, how is the work thinking about inland, more sort of green infrastructure than coastal nature-based approaches? Is the project also considering the compound flooding risks that the city faces as well?
So
Yeah,
Jeff, do you want to take the first half?
Yeah, let me answer in two parts, and then I'm going to pass off to Chris Osgood to kind of talk about that inland and that compound flooding, because I think they're two separate conversations, but great conversations. First of all, Dr. Andrew McQueen with Engineering with Nature has been great working with us and on our team. In fact, he allowed me and gave me the privilege of being a contributing author on a recent article that he did, and hopefully will be published here in the next few months in Frontier Journal, specifically looking at engineering with nature in a city of Boston type scenario. So to answer your first question, yes, we're working directly with Dr. Andrew McQueen from the Engineering with Nature program, and he really focuses a lot on dense urban marsh type settings like this. And I know he's worked and we've collaborated with Stone Living Labs, and it's been a great relationship from that perspective. Now, as far as compound flooding, I think it's important that we highlight two things. Number one, we are a piece of that resilience puzzle. When I say we're a piece of that resilience puzzle, that means that while we may take care of low probability, high consequence events, there is still a need to manage stormwater. There's still a need to manage interior drainage. There's still a need to evaluate rising sea level impacts on the groundwater table, right? And especially in a lot of these filled low-lying areas. And so that's where a lot of our work and collaboration with Boston Water Sewer comes in, working with the city and the state, because maybe as we implement our project, it allows for opportunities for the city to take on smaller projects like rain gardens and stormwater and pervious pavers and pervious pavement type parking lots and everything. So it opens up an opportunity, and it has to be a larger piece, a look at that resilience puzzle. But I'll pass it off to Chris Osgood and let him kind of talk a little bit more about the larger city resilience plan.
I mean, Jeff, you just did a great job sort of covering a lot of that. And Joe, you know this already quite well, but certainly with these projects and all of our coastal projects, we are looking at that intersection of stormwater risk, coastal flood risk, and urban heat island as well, or extreme heat. And with a lot of credit to folks like Charlie Jewell, who is on this call and leads planning for the Boston Water and Sewer Commission and our Office of Green Infrastructure and the Streets Cabinet. There's a lot of work which is happening very specific to inland flood risk associated with stormwater flooding. And there's a lot of coordination, as you well know, with a lot of the Mystic River Watershed, Neponset River Watershed, Charles River Watershed associations in those municipalities. So I think this study gives us an opportunity to really think about the intersection of those risks along the coastal edge, but is also a continued prompt to make sure that we're addressing it, not just along Boston's 47 miles of coastline, but across the city as a whole.
Okay, I'm going to go back to the chat for our next question from John Hammond. What is the relationship between the U.S. Army Corps mandate and the federal lands of the National Park Service, NPS? Intervention alignments seem to skip the national park. So this one can be, I'll toss this one to you, Jeff, and we can help supplement.
Yeah, well, the relationship between us and the National Park Service is they are a cooperating and participating agency in the study. And while we appear to be skipping within their alignments, there are options there that if National Park Service is to do a resilience plan and a project which they have planned, well, then we would have to incorporate that into our future without project condition. And so it's important for us to be communicating with them, because depending as to what they do, it's going to alter our approach to that. And then the second piece is if the National Park Service wants our alignment to wrap around specifically to focus on that, well, then there is an interagency type relationship, because we're both federal services, and it's not necessarily the city of Boston paying to improve and maintain and sustain and operate National Park Service lands. And so there's a separate relationship there. But just like I'll use U.S. Coast Guard Station Boston, as well as down by Reserve Channel, there's an Army Reserve type area there. And so although they are federal government and federal services, we are working with them and participating in them. And if we look to incorporate either by virtue of including their project into ours as a future with project, in other words, they don't do theirs, we do theirs, there would be an agreement there, or they would do theirs and then we would just incorporate it into our future without project condition. So I hope that helps, but the bottom line is City of Boston is our partner on this particular effort, and so we need to make sure that we understand where all those different relationships lie.
And then another question from the chat. Thank you, Kathy Abbott. Does the Army Corps have a role in recommending areas for relocation? And how does the Army Corps work with the active port locations? So does the Corps have a role in recommending areas for relocation? And how does the Army Corps work with active port areas? Back to you, Jeff.
Yeah, of course. You give me the hard ones. No, it's a great question. And rather than talking about relocation, let's talk about a term I like to use, managed retreat. And the two can sometimes be conflated because relocation could be construed as, hey, rather than do anything to protect your area, I'm going to make you move. But I'm not going to just make you move. I'm going to make your entire community move. And although there's very limited space in Boston, the community identity that you have, you got to go find elsewhere, whether it's dispersed or whether it's together somewhere else. Good luck. Here's some relocation assistance with you, right? That's relocation when it's taken from that kind of perspective. But now let's look at it from a managed retreat perspective. It might make sense for the next 50 years to try and defend in place to reduce that probability. But 50 to 100 years from now, when you see the continued rising sea levels, you have an option. You can essentially live in a concrete prison because the walls need to be so high that you are being influenced by water and threat and hazards on all sides. Or we can look at 30 to 50 years, defend in place. That gives the city and the state opportunity to build the necessary infrastructure in other locations to be able to migrate communities over time. And that's a responsible way to relocation. So from that perspective, are we looking at managed retreat? It'd be irresponsible for us not to. Because if we don't look at managed retreat in the future, you could have a bunch of island communities with no access to utilities just because it becomes completely cost prohibitive. So from that perspective, yes, we would consider relocation over time in a form of like managed retreat. Now, as far as the second question, Kate, I'm going to ask you to remind me so I don't ramble off and don't answer the question.
The second question is, how does the Army Corps work with the active port locations?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we actually have the port, we have the federal channel. It is a federal navigation channel. And so everything that we do within the port as far as maritime navigation, we have great interest in. And so any impacts that we have with our project has a direct impact on our federal navigation project. The second piece of that, though, is port infrastructure is critical infrastructure. So if critical infrastructure is damaged during a coastal storm, it needs to absolutely be a part of our scope. So to answer your question, two ways, probably more complicated than you wanted. Number one, it's a federal navigation channel, and so from a maritime navigation mission, we're very much interested in it and need to pay attention to it. And the second piece is that critical infrastructure, port infrastructure is critical infrastructure, and it's our CSRM mission to protect and manage the risk to that critical infrastructure.
Okay, and we've got another question in the chat. So this is from Nasser Rahim, and this is along the lines, this is going back to the federal jurisdiction and work between National Park Service. It's continuing on that question. Can you continue to explain along those lines how the new Charles River Dam is considered part or not part of the Boston CSRM study? Understanding how this project interacts with the other Army Corps projects, I think.
Yeah, Kate, man, I love this audience. These are some really good questions because it's hitting on things that I should have talked about and I didn't. So thank you for that question, because the reality is it's not just the new Charles River Dam. You also have Chelsea Creek. You also have Mud River. There's multiple Corps of Engineers projects and ongoing efforts in that area, as well as, and if you're not familiar with it, you'll become more familiar with it in the very near future, is a much larger state-led effort for the coast shed or the watershed in the metropolitan 18 communities within Boston Harbor. But let's just drill down and go straight to the New Charles River Dam. We are currently working with the state of Massachusetts, DCR, who owns the dam. So we constructed the dam, we manage the dam, we inspect the dam. However, it's actually maintained with DCR at the state level. And they've asked us to come in and look at, hey, what does the future condition of this, the operating condition of this dam look like? Do we need to make operational changes? Do we need to make structural changes? So that's an ongoing study parallel to this study in order to identify whether or not we need to do a dam modification effort with the state on that. For the condition of this particular study, we are not specifically scoped to include the New Charles River Dam into our scope. So we will tie into, where necessary, the New Charles River Dam, but as far as making operational changes to the dam or making structural changes to the wings of the dam and the abutments, et cetera, that's outside of the scope of this. And part of that reason is because it's a huge undertaking to do a dam safety modification, and that would impact our ability to really implement a lot of necessary structural fixes throughout the larger neighborhood. But the other piece is our partners is with the city of Boston, and that's a state-owned facility. And so it would create an additional layer of communication and challenge. And so we're allowing that project to go while working with that team and keeping in contact and sharing information. But we're working parallel to them, and we will make our plan adaptable to theirs, or if we finish before them, they will become adaptable and tie into ours.
Yeah, I think just to add on to what you said, Jeff, that we are actively working as part of that Charles Mystic regional collaboration for resilience project to stay in lockstep as the city of Cambridge and Mystic River Watershed Association works to come up with some regional solutions, as well as Charles River Watershed Association. But Chris, feel free to, did I miss anything there? Well, I really appreciate everybody's questions today. I don't see any more in the chat if I missed one. So, oh, beautiful timing now, sir. I'll read this one. Can you explain how the phasing of construction implementation post-congressional authorization gets funded? So, Jeff, another hard one for you, but post 2028, what does that look like?
Yeah, so I'm going to start that answer with, who knows? It could be funded, fully funded under a supplemental. It could be funded incrementally based off of an implementation and phasing plan that we recommend. It could be funded in any type of kind of combination thereof. So I have to unfortunately start that question with, who knows what's going to happen in 2028, 2029. But what I will tell you from our perspective is we understand and appreciate that the city of Boston, say this ends up being a $200 million project, maybe it's a $600 million project, maybe it's a $1 billion project, maybe it's even higher than that. Who knows? We're looking at robust systems across 47 miles of coastline over the next 15 years. It's not going to be $49.99. And so we need to make sure that we're working with the city of Boston to phase and implement this in such a manner that makes sense fiscally to the city of Boston, and communicate that vertically on the federal side to make sure that we don't mismanage expectations and create a situation where we're not able to move forward with a phased plan because our plan didn't line up with the non-federal sponsor plan. So with that being said, I'm going to throw the ball over to Chris Osgood and allow him to kind of talk about, what are some of the city tools and planning for non-federal funding.
Sure. Jeff, thanks so much. Just the same way in which it is true for the work that we're doing right now, the heart of our investment is city funds. The mayor has put more money into this 5-year capital plan, or sustained the sort of the highest level of city investment into coastal resilience projects at any point in the city's history. But the work across the 47 miles is a blended funding strategy. And so part of the work over the next 3 years really is to begin to think about how we phase this, and how we phase this both in terms of risk, in terms of other projects which are being advanced, and our capability together to be able to move that work forward. So that is part of what we hope to sort of tease out over the next 3 years as we head towards the spring of 2028.
Wonderful. So I'm going to just kind of walk through our next steps here. I'm going to pull up the next slide just to show again the invitation while people think of their last minute questions. If you still have one, please raise your hand. I'll just review this. We have our office hours. I'd love to meet you in person. I'd love to have a conversation or dig into more of the details. From what you learned tonight, it was a lot of content, and I know a lot of it is we're all getting up to speed on the Army Corps' detailed process, which has a lot of acronyms. So I appreciate everyone for staying with us tonight. If you do have some additional feedback that you'd like to provide in writing, you're welcome to do so. Use that center QR code and the links in the chat from earlier. And then again, if you'd still like to continue the conversation and schedule a one-on-one appointment with the core team, the city team, and yourself, please feel free. We have some appointments available over the next couple of weeks here for you to meet with us. But thank you again, everybody, for your time. Just before we let you go from the recording, I wanted to give Chris Hatfield from U.S. Army Corps an opportunity to give a little thank you before we close out.
Hey, I'm not sure. Okay, there he goes.
Hi.
Hi,
Hey,
Chris,
thanks.
we can hear you.
Yeah, Kate, thanks for organizing this, and Jeff and Chris for just going through a great presentation. And we're just excited about working with the community to really put forth a good plan here, and continue to need your input as we work on that. So thank you everyone for coming.
All right, with that, I will be posting. Thank you again so much for coming. I'm going to stop the